Hi, my name is Gabriel Jaramillo. I'm the Director of Healthy Communities with the Vitalist Health Foundation. Today we'll be hearing from Koren Manning with the City of Tucson's Planning and Development Services Department to talk about the relatively new accessory dwelling unit ordinance that just passed, and hear some of the struggles and the positives and how production of the ADUs are coming along. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm really excited about highlighting some of our partners that are highlighted within our promising practices report, showing some of the innovative techniques, not only in zoning, but in development that will lead to a diversification of housing, which will lead to what we hope to is more affordable types of housing, more attainable housing that's either rental or ownership and the various types. And we're lucky to have Koren and Shay share their models today. Our promising practices report is on our website for anybody to take a look at. You can see some detail about either one of these efforts, whether it be the ADU ordinance, the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, or Cuadro, and some of the work that they're doing. Right now, I'll hand it over to Koren to go into some of the best practices and overview, some of the successes and some of the obstacles that they've had to go through as a city to pass these ordinances and the success that they've seen from that. Koren?
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm Koren Manning with City of Tucson Planning and Development Services. And I'm going to share a little bit about our accessory dwelling unit program and how we have allowed this housing type in Tucson in recent years. So basically, we started working on this a few years ago. Tucson has long, or casitas, I like to say, or accessory dwelling units have been a part of Tucson's built form and kind of our local architectural style for a long time. And casitas have been a really important part of our housing stock for decades. But until recently, our zoning code actually did not allow this housing type. So it was most of the casitas around town either predated zoning or were built in ways that kind of worked around zoning. But we recognized that this was a really important part of our existing housing stock, and the casitas had opportunity to provide for a niche in our housing market that was not really being served, which is it's a way of providing lower cost housing, providing housing for multi-generational households, for folks to age in place, and other housing needs. So we were hearing across our community a lot of interest in being able to build these casitas and have it be allowed in our zoning. So we worked with stakeholders in our community, architects, housing providers, and housing advocacy groups, senior housing folks, neighborhood representatives. We worked with a really broad cross-section of our community to develop an ordinance that would allow casitas in Tucson. So after a lot of dialogue and looking at different options for how we could change our code, our mayor and council adopted a code change in December 2022 that legalized casitas in all residential zones across the city. So we took a really broad approach to where casitas could be developed. So one ADU is now allowed on every residential site in the city. There are regulations on the size and height of those units. So there is a maximum size of 10% of the lot, and with a maximum of 1,000 square feet per casita. There is a minimum, though, of 650 square feet. So no matter the lot size, casita can be at least 650 square feet, which allows enough space for a pretty comfortable studio or one bedroom. There's also a maximum height of 12 feet. However, the casita can go up to the height of the primary structure. So if you have a primary home that's taller than 12 feet, the casita can be a bit taller. A few other aspects of the regulation are there is a requirement for a pool roof. That was important to us to ensure that these are helping meet our climate and sustainability goals. There's no owner occupancy requirement. That's something that some other communities have included, but it was important to us to allow flex. And what we really heard from the community was people wanted flexibility in how these casitas are used. And from talking to people, we saw the casitas really evolve over time in terms of who the occupants are, whether they're used for family members, sometimes tenants, These are a very adaptable and flexible housing type, and we wanted to allow that flexibility over time. There is a requirement for one parking space per ADU. However, that can be waived in areas that are close to transit. So any lot that is within a quarter mile of transit or our bike boulevards does not need to provide parking, and that parking can also be satisfied through the use of on-street parking. So the majority of casitas or ADUs would not require additional parking, which can sometimes be a barrier on certain lots. So that's an overview of the standards. On the next slide, we have some of the successes and challenges. So I would say in terms of successes, we really tried to do a lot of outreach and education soon after this ordinance was adopted. We developed a worksheet to help the public understand the new regulations and kind of walk people through how it applies to their lot, what they can build on their site, how to design and permit their ADU. That's been very popular and has been referenced by a lot of the public as they go through the process. And I would just say there's a very strong community interest. A lot of people are interested in building an ADU. And then we've been able to partner with a number of organizations to help promote ADUs. So Quadro Design and Mi Casita has hosted information sessions that have really helped spread the word among the community about this new housing option. Challenges, one of the initial challenges was requirement for separate utilities. We were actually able to problem solve that pretty quickly and work to create a waiver in our building code so that ADUs would not require separate utility hookups, and that brought costs down. I would say another major challenge is our impact fees. Our impact fee structure, ADUs are considered a dwelling unit, so they do incur impact fees. Whereas a guest house does not. So this still kind of pushes some people to permit their unit as a guest house rather than an EDU, with the major difference being there that a guest house is not permitted to have a full kitchen. Accessory dwelling units are permitted to have a full kitchen because they're an independent unit. And then I would say just overall cost is a major barrier for a lot of families and households that want to build an ADU. While it is a lower cost option than a lot of other options people may be considering, there's still cost involved in the design and construction process. Another thing we're still working on is how to allow previously unpermitted units to come into compliance with zoning. That can be a bit tricky, so we're continuing to work on that. And then I would say another challenge is those the requirements around or limitations that were put in the code around size and height. That has been a limitation for some sites where it might be a more constrained lot, and having some additional heights would allow for loft style accessory dwelling unit, something that makes more efficient use of the yard space where an ADU is being permitted. And same with the square footage, that can be a limiting factor. If somebody wants to build a slightly larger ADU that might have 2 bedrooms and accommodate more family members or tenants. So those are some of the successes and challenges that we're still working through. Next slide. So in terms of results, this is just looking at the past year since the ordinance was adopted, and these are some stats from actually earlier this year. So since this time, we have had more units permitted, but this is really just in the first year since the ordinance was adopted. We got 61 applications for ADUs. 24 of those were approved as of, again, January of this year. And we've had quite a few more under review since then. Many of these have been approved. So again, really strong interest. That's a lot of new housing for our city that otherwise would not have been permitted. What we're seeing in terms of the type of development, most of these are detached units. So freestanding units, often in the backyard or side yard. A few have been attached units, but the vast majority are detached. Most are new construction. So of those 61, 40 were new builds and 15 were conversions, usually conversion of a garage or carport, sometimes a backyard structure like a shed, but mostly new construction. And then in terms of size, the most typical we're seeing is 750 square feet. So kind of in the middle of the range of what's allowed. And that tracks with the typical lot size in Tucson. So generally, we do see that people are maximizing that 10% that's allowed based on their lot size. And again, with the height, most of the ADUs are 12 feet. So again, people are really trying to maximize the space, especially in a small unit. Having higher ceilings, maybe a loft space, really adds to the open feel of the space and usability of the space. So those are some of the trends we're keeping an eye on and we'll be considering as we think about potential future revisions to this code and ways to improve over time and modify the code to make sure it's usable for our community. Next slide. So next steps for Tucson. So obviously changing the code and adopting the zoning ordinance to allow accessory dwelling units was a huge step forward in allowing this housing type in Tucson that previously was not allowed. But there's lots more to do to make ADUs accessible and affordable for our community. So one of the things we're working on right now is developing a catalog of pre-approved model plans. This is a way to make it easier for someone who's just thinking about building an ADU, give people sort of an entry place, a starting point if they want to build an ADU. We were recently awarded a community challenge grant from the AARP to fund a model plan competition. So we will be launching that this summer and hope to use that as a way to build a catalog of pre-approved model plans. So those plans would already be approved for building code, so people have that certainty that if I use one of these models, I'm meeting the building code. I can adapt it maybe a little bit for the needs of my site, but provide certainty in the process and should bring down some of the design fees and permitting fees. So that's something we're working on right now. We're also trying to create an ADU resource directory to help connect people, interested homeowners, with resources in our community, be it designers, construction, industry folks, and community organization to support the process. And really trying to work on promoting some of the city and community programs to support ADU development. So for example, our housing department has a program in place to provide funding for rehab of ADUs or buildings that can be used for an ADU. So we're really working with our housing department to promote that program. And then I mentioned before the process of permitting structures that may have been previously unpermitted. So we're continuing to look at options for amnesty and a way to bring those structures into conformance so it can be used as safe and permitted housing. And then we are going to be looking at the impact fee levels. I mentioned that has been one of the challenges. So we're looking at ways we could potentially modify our impact fees for ADUs and other types of small infill that we know have might have less impacts on our infrastructure, trying to make those impact fees more commensurate with their impact. So those are things we're working on. Again, there's a huge amount of interest in our community, and so we're really trying to meet that community interest with programs, partnerships, and incentives to allow people to build this housing type. And I will pass it over to Shay to talk. Or go ahead, Shay.
And Koren, actually, I had a couple questions for you because this is amazing. Really glad to see the ordinances. I have two questions for you. One, I'm glad to see that there was community outreach and there's been a lot of community interest. What has been the feedback from the community now that this has passed and you're seeing some applications come through, and as these projects begin development, what is some of the feedback you're getting from the community?
I think the feedback we're getting is that there's a lot of interest. A lot of people, started to hear more about ADUs and casitas as we were developing this ordinance. And people, it really resonated with a lot of people in our community. So many people are looking for ways to have more space, whether it's for an elderly family member or young family members who are maybe starting out or coming back from college. So I just feel like there was a really strong resonance in our community and people really want this option. But what we've seen and we've heard over the past year and a half since this ordinance was adopted is just, I'm very interested, but the process is complex. Like, where do I start? Most people don't have experience designing a new home and figuring out the permitting process. So that's why we really hope the model plans and some of the other resources that we want to put in place will help people navigate that process. And I think model plans in particular will really provide people a starting place and some more certainty about what are the steps if I want to build an ADU, and what are like 2 or 3 options I could just consider for my lots, rather than kind of the sky's the limit. You have to, start from square one in terms of designing your ADU. So that's the feedback we're getting, is a lot of interest, but really a lot of interest in more tools to make the process easier.
No, I appreciate it. And kind of continuing on. So if there's, I guess, giving advice to other cities, especially larger municipalities or larger cities that are looking to create new ordinances around ADUs, and highlighted in some of your next steps is really addressing some of those concerns or some of those obstacles that you guys have faced as this rolls out. What is some feedback or some advice you would give to cities as they consider an ADU ordinance?
So I think my advice or feedback is really to try to keep it simple as possible, because navigating code is very challenging for the community and for, a typical homeowner. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. We tried to keep it pretty simple in terms of what the standards are. Over time, that might evolve further. But I think in some ways, kind of the fewer complicated regulations or restrictions that we put in place for casitas or ADUs, the better, to make it really easy for folks.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. We look forward to including this in our online update.